We do believe that it's likely that that plane was shot down by an Iranian missile. Just before I came here, I was on the phone with my Canadian counterpart. They were working to get their resources on the ground. And when we get the results of that investigation, I am confident we and the world will take appropriate actions in response.
Canadian officials are en route to the site of this week's devastating plane crash in Tehran. But what are they arriving to? New footage shows a site that's been largely cleared of debris and left unsecure. Reports on the ground suggest there isn't much plane left at the site, and there are no guards protecting the area. Locals can be seen canvassing for any pieces of value left behind. Canadian and U.S. intelligence shows Iran shot down the plane carrying 176 people, including 63 Canadians. 138 people in total were headed to Canada. Iran denies the claim and is accusing both governments of engaging in, quote, psychological warfare. So will we ever get a definitive answer about what happened? Can investigators find the truth without a crash site to investigate? Mary Schiavo is a former U.S. Department of Transportation Inspector General. She's now a transportation lawyer and joins us from Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, Ms. Schiavo. Nice to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just start off by saying I think since we last spoke last night, we learned that the Transportation Safety Board here in Canada, Iran had invited some members of that board, some inspectors, to come to Iran, but we're still waiting word on whether or not they're going to receive visas and to what extent they'll be able to participate in the investigation. What's your read on even just the fact that they have been permitted to go?
Well, that's what's required under the International Civil Aviation Organization, an offshoot of the UN guidelines on how to conduct an investigation. It was in their written announcement yesterday that they would invite all nations who had persons on the plane, the flag of the airline, and of course, the manufacturer of the plane. And what really is important, though, is that they be allowed to be a participant, observe all the proceedings in the investigation, and not just be allowed to go to Iran and sit around and wait for news, but to be there to safeguard the information, the investigation, and really represent their nation for the number of people that were lost. That's really important to the families.
What would they be doing if they were granted access? Would they be overseeing what Iranian investigators are doing, or what? How do you envision that would work?
Well, really, that's not a bad way to put it. They would be able to observe every step of the investigation. Now, obviously, you know, one person can't see and do everything, but they would be able to see it, to observe it, if necessary, to request additional testing, to participate in the testing. You know, for example, even the download of the black boxes. For most investigations, the party nations want to be there when the black boxes are downloaded. When they print out the data, when they make the decision to make the data available to the public. And by the way, the black box data usually is posted on the investigation docket, which is a public site where people can access it. And so, and particularly the treatment and the testing and the handling of the passengers, of the remains, is very important to every nation whose passengers were on that plane.
So far, what we've seen from some American networks, which have been there near the site or at the site reporting on it, is that much of it is gone. Much of it has been cleared away. Right. It doesn't appear that there is any kind of secure or perimeter secured, rather, around the site. Based on that, what is your take on it?
Well, that's actually, that's actually a very significant mistake, because in the case here where the possibility, and it certainly looks like that's what it is, of a missile strike, you need to test all of those pieces for explosive residue. You can tell the difference in the testing between jet fuel and the explosive residue from a missile or a bomb. And then also you need to chart out where every piece of the plane fell. It's very important how the wreckage fell. You know, for example, if a piece of the plane separated early, if it wasn't a bomb, for example, it was an engine malfunction, as Iran first said, then you'd want to know if pieces of that engine exited the plane before the plane came down. And to do that, you very carefully map the site where every piece is picked up. If they bulldoze the site, they clearly did not do that.
Is there any way that any of that could have been done in the short time frame, in the 3 days, in essence, since the crash?
Well, not from the pictures that we have seen. Now, there is new technology, and some of it's being developed in Canada, to map the site with drones and computer programs where you can literally photograph the whole site and have it mapped out, and the drones take pictures of the wreckage where it is on the site. But the problem, and that's a good thing, but then you have to pick up the wreckage and you have to safeguard it. You don't want to just scoop it up with a scoop with dirt and mud and destroy the pieces of evidence that might be on it. So you have to carefully then pack up and cart away the pieces of the wreck. For example, in the crash of TW-800, which was the fuel tank explosion, one of the rare exceptions to an airplane coming apart in midair that was not a bomb or a missile, they used those pieces to literally put the plane back together to ascertain if their theory was right, that it was a center fuel tank explosion.
If you were the Canadian officials who are tasked with going over there, what would you specifically be asking for at this point?
Literally to follow along at every step. I mean, the loss of life from Canada is just stunningly large. I mean, I can't think of a recent crash in which one nation has suffered such a large loss of citizens, and they should be asking to go along every step of the way. And with a transparent investigation, that should not be a problem. Canada is a party to the investigation. They should be able to see what is occurring, watch the downloads, have a copy of the data as soon as possible, see how the materials are being tested for explosive residue, see how they are taking care of the passengers from the plane, how they are processing the bodies, et cetera, and also see what access they are going to have to the radar tapes, to the air traffic control tapes, and all the other evidence that comes from sources other than the plane.
Based on your experience, does Canada have any recourse if all of what you described is denied? Does Canada have any recourse?
Well, they can always make protests, but they do have a huge recourse, and that is once the official crash investigation is completed, then the second step takes over, and that is the litigation and the legal fact-finding. And by the Montreal Treaty, which is a treaty that aviation nations of the world follow, Iran is not a signatory, but the airlines nation is, Ukraine and Canada are. That means that next step is the litigation. The legal fact-finding of who is legally responsible, Canada is one of the jurisdictions that is guaranteed under that treaty. So Canada will play the biggest role, most likely, in that litigation.
Okay, thank you again for your perspective and your insights this evening. Really appreciate it. That's Mary Schiavo, former Inspector General with the U.S. Department of Transportation. As Canadians wait for answers from the site of the plane crash, we're learning more about what was happening behind the scenes as tensions between Washington and Tehran grew worse. CBC News has learned Canada believes it should have been given advance notice from the U.S. about the drone strike that killed Iran's top general. Katie Simpson has those details from Washington. Hi, Katie. Tell us what do you know?
Here's what we know so far. According to two senior Canadian government sources, it's Canada's position that Canada should have been given advance notice from the U.S. about its decision to target the Iranian general, the most senior Iranian general, in a drone strike. And on top of that, Canada would like more information about the American justification for its decision. One of the sources telling CBC News that when Canada is working so closely with a trusted ally like the United States in a volatile region like Iraq, it can become quite problematic when you're trying to carry out those operations and not all of the partners fully grasp what is going on or the decisions that the lead team, the United States, is making. When there isn't an ability to grasp fully why certain decisions have been made, it makes things difficult, the source said. However, despite whatever disappointment Canada may be feeling at this point, that it wasn't given that heads up, that it doesn't necessarily have all of the information it's looking for, both of the senior sources said it does not fundamentally change the Canada-U.S. relationship, that even though that this is not how Canadian officials had necessarily wanted things to unfold, that ultimately the Canada-U.S. relationship remains the same. Canada shares the same military objective priorities that the United States does, the same national security objectives that the United States does, and so that is something that is not going to change in the wake of this, according according to the two sources that we spoke with. We've also learned that in the moments once Canada did get official confirmation that the Iranian general had been killed, there was an immediate response behind the scenes from the Canadian government. There was an immediate understanding that this was a significant change in the already volatile region, and that there was the potential for massive consequences as a result of this U.S. decision. And so that is something that was expressed to the Prime Minister from top officials within the senior government. There was a very fast briefing pulled together for the Prime Minister, who was on vacation in Costa Rica at the time. But again, Canada's position, according to two senior government sources, they're telling CBC News Canada should have been given a heads up, and that Canada would like needs a further explanation in terms of why the U.S. decided to make this move.
Any official reaction or response from the government to that information you garnered from your sources?
Well, we reached out to the Prime Minister's office and no one responded with anything on the record. But more broadly, today, Chris Hall, our colleague who hosts CBC Radio's The House, he had an interview with the Foreign Affairs Minister, and they were speaking more broadly about the ongoing complexity in the region, in the Middle East, some of the complexities between the Canada-U.S. relationship, but really focusing on the bond between Canada and the U.S. and whether perhaps there's concern that Canada and the U.S. are tied too closely together. Have a listen to what Chris Hall asks and the response from the minister.
Are we too close potentially to the United States in these kinds of geopolitical crises?
Well, none of what happened was of our choosing. You know, first there was the Iranian strike on a basis where we have Canadian personnel. We had gone into protection force, so we avoided casualty. Then there was obviously the downing of the aircraft, which is a real tragedy, and Canada is the second largest contingent. So it is, I was saying to everyone I've been speaking around the world, Canada, Canadians have a lot of questions, and we will push for answers. So why we are engaging with partners is to make sure that we can play a meaningful role, to get all the evidence we get, to get all the facts we can gather, so that we can be progressing the investigation and providing all the answers that people deserve.
Now, when it comes to that downed plane crash, the sources say that Canada is not at any sort of point where they're looking to point a finger or they're looking to lay blame. They say the priority right now is ensuring that there is a thorough and fair investigation of what happened, as well as the more immediate concern that the families and loved ones of the victims of that plane crash, the Canadian victims, are able to get visas to ensure that the bodies of the victims are repatriated to Canada in a respectful way.
All right, thanks, Katie. Really appreciate those details and the update. The CBC's Katie Simpson for us from Washington.
Today they're accountable for murder and mayhem. The goal of our campaign is to deny the regime the resources to conduct its destructive foreign policy. We want Iran to simply behave like a normal nation. We believe the sanctions that we impose today further that strategic objective.
The U.S. has announced another round of sanctions against Iran. It's a response to Iran's airstrikes against U.S. and allied troops earlier this week, airstrikes that were retaliation for the U.S. killing Iran's top general. The escalation in tensions has been an unsettling start to a new year. Will 2020 be marked by fears of a war between the U.S. and Iran? Ian Bremmer is the president at Eurasia Group. I spoke with him a bit earlier this afternoon. Hi, Mr. Bremmer. Nice to see you again. Thanks for making time for us.
My pleasure.
Let me start off by asking you about your group, which assesses these sort of top risks. You come up with a list every year, the top risks for 2020. Obviously, it's a longer list, but given what's happened over the last week, where does the U.S.'s relationship with Iran factor into that?
Quite low. And I'll tell you that it came out after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, so we could have said, oh, definitely it's at the top of the list. We really don't believe and didn't believe that there was significant likelihood of war between the two countries. Trump has had very little interest in wagging the dog, as they say. If he wanted war with Iran, he had plenty of opportunity, especially after the Saudis were hitting their oil fields. And once the Iranians saw that Trump did hit them back, for hitting the U.S. base and the the embassy, and then the Supreme Leader actually going on Twitter and saying you can't do anything, they back down real fast, right? A massive de-escalation. They're now in a lot of trouble, right? I mean, not only did they, have their bluff called in a big way, but their economy is contracting almost 10% this year in 2019, 9.5% contraction. And, of course, this horrible tragedy with the civilian airliner and all these Canadians knocked down dead, and clearly the Iranians responsible for it, but publicly saying they're not. And that means that not only the Americans taking them on, but also the Canadians, the Europeans, the advanced industrial democracies who've been trying to get the Americans back to the table in terms of the nuclear deal really aren't going to be carrying any water for them. So, I mean, actually, Iran really needs to behave in a more constructive way going forward. They're under massive pressure internationally to do so. And I think we're going to see that. I suspect that there's going to be some efforts made towards restarting diplomacy in the comparatively near future.
I want to ask you a bit more about that, because I think just before I was coming here to do this interview, I was watching a press conference from the White House in which they were talking about what President Trump had announced a few days ago, which is that they were going to increase the sanctions as a result of the missile strikes the other day. I saw in your analysis as well, for all their bluster, I'm just quoting it, Iranian elites retain a healthy respect for U.S. power. Can you expand on that a bit for us?
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of people said Trump was really lucky that the Iranians backed down. But all I want to say is, when you are the leader of the world's largest economy and the world's largest military, you get luckier, right? I mean, you can miscalculate more. Before this, Trump's biggest win in foreign policy, arguably, was when he told the Mexicans that if they didn't tighten up the border and devote more resources to it, that he was going to make their head spin economically. He was going to put massive tariffs on. And López Obrador, the Mexican president, immediately threw a lot of money at the border, and we saw 50% fewer people coming across it as a consequence. Is that because Trump miscalculates, got lucky? No, it's because the Mexicans need the U.S. a lot more than the U.S. needs Mexico. So that's the point, is that the Iranians didn't know until last Friday where the red line was with the United States. I mean, they hit some tankers, they captured one, they knocked down a major U.S. drone, that Global Hawk, they hit the Saudis, and Trump wasn't doing anything, right? He wasn't reacting. And so they didn't know what the red lines were. Well, I'll tell you, once Soleimani was killed, they found out what the Americans' red lines were. And that, frankly, that clarity is significantly de-escalatory. And I think the Iranians are obviously the most important committed adversary to the U.S. in the region. That doesn't change going forward. But they're not suicidal. They're rational. And so I think you see that playing out in very clear relief this week.
And when you talk about, for example, the increased pressure on Iran, I'm wondering, and I'm sure our viewers are, given how many Canadians were on that plane, if you think that Canada will be able to leverage that insofar as we are now seeking access to, whatever investigation takes place, or even access to Iran, do you think that there might be more willingness on the part of Iran, given that increase in pressure that you cite?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that they're not going to want to alienate or antagonize the Canadians more than they think is necessary. So they're going to want the Canadians off their back, satisfied to some degree. But they're also not going to want to open up for the Iranian domestic audience the idea that they could be responsible for killing all of these Iranians. Now, Iran doesn't have an open media, of course. They've got control of their internet. They've got control of their media organs. It's not Canada. So it is possible the Iranians will be able to speak out of both sides of their mouths. And the Canadians are going to have to ask themselves how comfortable they are with that, because it's hard to imagine that the Iranian government would publicly come clean, even if you have full investigations where it's obvious that the culpability lies on the Tehran regime. Not that they intended to knock it down, but that they knocked it down nonetheless. I mean, let's keep in mind, when the Russian little green men in southeast Ukraine knocked down that KLM jet, there were full investigations that eventually occurred. It was completely clear that the Russians had culpability, and yet the Russians were willing to accept absolutely no responsibility for that. The Americans didn't find that acceptable. The Dutch didn't find that acceptable. So the real question here is, how is Trudeau likely to respond to that? Yesterday, when the news was coming across the transom, Trudeau was clearly beside himself internally. And I mean, he projected a more calm face, but there's anyone that talked to him understood exactly how he felt. Let's see how he's going to handle it.
When we talk more broadly about the top risks as your group identifies them, and you're thinking about that region, we heard Secretary Pompeo today talk about, for example, an increased presence in Iraq. A lot of people in this country, or a lot of military watchers, are saying that's going to be really difficult to even resume the missions that are there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Vashti, I mean, the funny thing is, a month ago, Trump would have been very happy with the idea of being able to get U.S. troops out of Iraq. But now, of course, that the Iraqis are saying, we need you out. The Iranians say, we need you out. Now, of course, he doesn't want to do it. So part of it is, how do you square that circle? Can Trump actually accept a win, even though the optics are not necessarily great? And for him, the optics are in many ways more important than the substance on the ground. So there's that. Then there's also the question of the United States being able to continue to proselytize the fight against terror, which is, nominally and legally why they're there. According to the AUMF, that's true in Syria, and America's ability to fight ISIS on the ground in Syria, having accomplished an awful lot on the ground, is now significantly reduced. America had to suspend its operations against ISIS and other terrorist organizations in Iraq following the parliamentary vote a few days ago. Now, there's no decision yet formally from the Iraqi government to make the Americans leave. But the prime minister, who's a caretaker right now, has clearly moved in that direction, saying, we want you to tell us how you're going to operationalize that movement. The Americans, of course, sent a letter saying that we're going to take them out, but then it turned out, well, that was just a draft, even though there was actually an Arabic translation and they were both on letterhead. That's no draft. Huge mistake. But still, there's a big question mark here, and we don't know exactly whether the Iranians will ultimately be able to pull off something in Soleimani's death that he desperately wanted but wasn't able to accomplish while he was alive, which is the withdrawal, the removal of U.S. troops from Iraq. One final point I would mention on this is, keep in mind that when Iraq is an authoritarian regime, you can keep the Shia out of government. When Iraq is a democracy, the population is about 63% Shia. Iran will necessarily be the most influential external force on the ground in the country, and that creates some backlash. But, I mean, the idea that the Americans are going to be able to call the shots ultimately in Iraq is just not the case. And the question is how we get from here to there.
Okay, on that point, I have to leave it. I'm out of time. But thank you very much, Mr. Bremer. Pleasure, as always, to have you on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Ian Bremer, president of the Eurasia Group. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.